Hi everyone, my name is Laura and this is AnneOfGreenBooks. Today I want to talk about two of the books I finished most recently. They don't have anything to do with each other, they're just the two books I've read most recently and I want to talk about both of them, and I didn't feel like filming or editing separate videos. So you get reviews of both of them in this video. One of them is quite popular and came out recently and a lot of people have read it. And the other one I would say is pretty underrated. As far as I know, not many people have read it and it doesn't have a ton of ratings on Goodreads, but I would really recommend it. So I guess in that sort of dichotomy, maybe they have some relation to each other. I'll give you one book I think is overrated and one book that I think is underrated that I recommend, but they really don't have anything to do with each other. So the first book that I want to talk about, I read The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. You can see I have my library copy here. I checked it out from the library. And I think I'm in maybe a fairly unique position with having read this book. I'm sure there are other people where this was their first Leigh Bardugo, but you don't hear about a lot of booktubers or, any of the people that I follow reading this as their first Leigh Bardugo. Most people have read a lot of Leigh Bardugo before. I had not. So I decided to pick up The Familiar because I wanted to try out Leigh Bardugo. I know she's really popular and people love her books. And I wanted to try her out for myself, kind of see what the hype was about. But I didn't really know where to start in her backlist of books. I want to read like Six of Crows and, other books in the Gracia verse, but I didn't know where I needed to start. Everyone loves Six of Crows, and it seems like maybe I can start there, but I wasn't sure if I had to read Shadow and Bone first or what. So I intend to still read some of those, but I figured I would start with The Familiar since it was a new book and to my knowledge, it's a standalone. So it seemed like an easy place to start. I read The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo and it was my first Leigh Bardugo book. Overall, my thoughts on the book are mixed. Actually, let me check what I rated it on Storygraph. I think I gave it a 2.5, which for me is a pretty low rating. I have to check. Yeah, I gave it a 2.5. It was an interesting reading experience because starting out, I definitely enjoyed it from the first page. I liked the writing style. It was easy to read and it flowed nicely. And I think that there were some beautifully written sentences and good descriptive imagery. It's definitely a writing style that I enjoy and I could see myself reading more of. I pretty quickly found myself getting kind of annoyed and just disinterested in certain aspects of the book. So this is an adult book, not a young adult book. And I know that a lot of Leigh Bardugo's previous books have been YA to my knowledge. And then I think she forayed into adult books with Ninth House and the sequel to that, I think. This is roughly the extent of my knowledge of her books. And a lot of times reading this book, I thought it felt like a YA book with dark elements added to sort of age it up to adult, which is my least favorite kind of adult book. I felt while I was reading it like I would prefer just reading YA from Leigh Bardugo. So that's why I'm really still planning on trying some of the Grishaverse books. I don't know that I ever have any interest in picking up Ninth House, given my experience with The Familiar. But I was definitely enjoying her writing, and I'm definitely going to try more from Leigh Bardugo. But the reading experience of this book was mixed for me, and it went steadily downhill the more of the book that I read. So that's my overall non-spoilery review. Furthermore, the romance in The Familiar was such a mixed bag for me in my reading experience. Because I wrote in my notes that Leigh Bardugo writes romance and romantic tension really well. So I was liking the writing style and the sort of tropes used and the ways the romance developed in The Familiar. It had some elements of angst that I would normally really enjoy. And I was sort of reading it and thinking, if these were characters that I cared about more, I would be really invested in this romance. But as it wasn't working for me. And a lot of that is what I've said, that I didn't necessarily like or relate to or care about the characters. But, as I was reading, I was really like, I could see myself being so obsessed and having such a fun time with a different Leigh Bardugo book. If I were really invested in the characters, I think I would be having a great time with the ways she writes romance and romantic tension. So that was really interesting for me. The last thing that I wrote in my notes, that's non-spoilery about the book, is the chapters were all quite short, and it seemed like they were all exactly the same length. I don't know if this is true or not, but it really felt like each chapter was like 5 to 7 pages, and they were all the same length. And something about it kind of interrupted my reading flow. I would get into the chapter, and then it would end, and then it would be the next chapter, and I would get into it, and then it would end. And it felt kind of choppy. It reminded me of an issue that I had with reading To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini. I like To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. It wasn't my favorite. I kind of gave it a middling rating, but it had very cool ideas. But I kept really being taken out of my reading flow by not the chapter interruptions in that book, but the scene interruptions. There would be frequent scene breaks that to me didn't feel necessary, because really we were flowing from one scene into the next, but there would be a break in the page. And it seemed like it was being used to try to raise the tension. But for me, it just interrupted my reading flow. And I felt the same way about the chapters in The Familiar. This might be just how Leigh Bardugo writes. I might end up having this issue with other books. We'll see. But again, maybe if I were more invested in the characters, I wouldn't mind it so much. But it kind of annoyed me. It was a mild thing. I could have looked past it, but it kind of annoyed me. And additionally, the chapters, every single one, seemed to try to end on some sort of dramatic, tension-filled one-liner, which I get is just kind of how chapters work, but it felt really noticeable for me, where like the end of every chapter would be a lot of times like one sentence instead of a longer paragraph, and it would either be like a line of dialogue or just a narration sentence, but it would be kind of cliffhangery and really trying to be full of tension at the end of every chapter. And so just something about the structure of the chapters felt like I kept going on this sort of ride of like getting into a chapter, stopping, getting into a chapter, stopping, getting into a chapter, stopping. And it was too repetitive and choppy for me, and it took me out of my reading flow. So that was another issue I had with The Familiar that kind of made it not work for me. I just have a few more things I want to say about the romance in the book. So, some spoilers ahead. They might not be that big of spoilers though, because it might be clear from the plot summary roughly what happens in the book. But yeah, some spoilers ahead. So, the romance is between Luzia and Santanhel, and I was pretty quickly realizing that would be the romance, and I was pretty quickly annoyed because I personally am really over and really get annoyed by ancient immortal man falling in love with a young woman. I don't remember exactly Luzia's age or if it's specifically told, but like I said, this book felt to me kind of YA with just like some adult elements thrown in to make it an adult book instead of a YA book. And Luzia felt young to me. Maybe if she had felt a little older, I would have had less of a problem. But frankly, I think that just set me up to be annoyed by the romance. This is not to say that I am never interested in books with the ancient immortal falling in love with a young mortal. It can work. But this one didn't work for me. It's something that I frequently get annoyed about, especially if I am otherwise in some way losing interest in the book, if it's sort of falling flat for me. I specifically remember another book that I rated really low, even lower than this rating, was Spindle's End by Robin McKinley. For me, that book was boring, and then there was a romance between an old man and a young woman, and I was like, this is just the final straw. So it's something that just personally annoys me, and it didn't work for me. And not just because of the basic structure of like ancient old man falling in love with young woman. There were other things that didn't work for me and kind of annoyed me. Santanhel is described at parts of the book as, you know, he's kind of depressed, kind of over life. It's been a long time and he is in a rough situation. And then there's a part where it sort of describes Luzia as being the only thing that makes him want to live again. And that was just hard for me to buy. I was having a really hard time buying that there was any reason for Luzia and Santanhel to love each other, besides that they were just there. And, you know, you could tell from the plot structure of the book that it was going to be those two who fell in love. I wasn't feeling convinced by it. And something I just remembered that I didn't write in my notes is that I also really felt, you know, like I didn't see why Luzia and Santanhel were falling in love. But I also really felt like every man in this book was awful, except Santanhel. And, you know, that's probably accurate. Men suck, and men sucked more in the past during a Spanish Inquisition. I'm sure they were terrible. But it felt so much too obvious to me of the author kind of setting it up that, oh, she's going to fall in love with Santanhel because he's the only guy around worth falling in love with. It didn't work for me. I found it annoying. Also, Santanhel's first name is another name that I don't know how to pronounce. I'm going to say Gian. And every time I read it, I couldn't remember why at first, but I kept thinking about What We Do in the Shadows while I was reading The Familiar. Few reasons. First of all, I haven't read that many things about familiars, and so I found myself thinking about Guillermo from What We Do in the Shadows. And Santanhel's first name is Gian, which is the last name of the actor who plays Guillermo in What We Do in the Shadows. So I kept thinking about What We Do in the Shadows while I was reading this. And it was also kind of making it a point against the book that I kept thinking about What We Do in the Shadows, because I was thinking about how much more I like the sort of implied romance, hopefully someday canonical, we will see, but the relationship between Nandor and Guillermo, again, an ancient immortal man and a younger mortal. It's different for a lot of reasons. I think there's different dynamics when there is a relationship between two men or two people of the same gender. There is some of the patriarchy concerning elements removed. So that's a reason that that relationship is different. But I was also thinking about how Guillermo versus Luzia, Guillermo feels older in some ways, more capable, more on an even playing field with Nandor in some ways, in other ways not. But in the familiar, Luzia is quite strong. She has strong magic, but she is learning from Santanhel as well. So there's a little bit of a teacher-student dynamic where she just felt younger and less on this even playing field with Santanhel. And so, yeah, it was kind of not the book's fault necessarily, but I kept thinking of What We Do in the Shadows, and it was kind of a point against the book because I was thinking about what could make this better? Why am I not liking this? So kind of just a funny thing that I was like, Guillen Santanhel kept making me think of Harvey Guillen and thinking of What We Do in the Shadows. Final thoughts. I did heavily skim the last 100 pages because I was tired of the book going on. It felt a little longer than I wanted it to be, but I think in the end of the book, it did get more interesting, and I think some characters had some really interesting character development. So, it could be my fault that I was heavily skimming the end, that I didn't like the book better, but I wish that some of the interesting things that started happening in the end of the book maybe could have happened earlier. Maybe the book could have been a little shorter. This is always my review of books that I don't love. I feel like if they were shorter, maybe I would like them more, but I'm sure a lot of people loved the book and enjoyed how long it was, and more power to you for that. I will definitely try reading more Leigh Bardugo, and I think that I will find some that I will be really enjoying. I feel like I could love her books. But this one didn't work great for me. It was okay. I didn't give it a terrible rating. I read it all. I didn't DNF it. I enjoyed some things for sure, but it could have been better. All right, so that was the first book that I wanted to talk about. And the other book that I read recently that I really loved and want to talk about because I don't think enough people have read it or heard of it. And I thought it was a pretty cool book, so I really recommend it. I want to talk about Unity by Ellie Bangs. This is a sci-fi book, also very speculative fiction, and I think you could say that it has some horror elements. Horror is a genre that I've very recently gotten into at all, so I don't consider myself very experienced in speaking on horror elements, but I would say that this had some horror elements, but I think it's good for any readers of sci-fi or speculative fiction of any kind. It's a very cool book. I might have a hard time summarizing it myself any better than the blurb on the back of the book. So I will just read the blurb on the back of the book to tell you what the book is about. So the blurb says, Danae is not only herself. She is concealing a connection to a grieving collective inside of her body. But while she labors as a tech servant in the dangerous underwater enclave of Bloom City, her fractured self cannot mend. In a desperate escape, Danae and her lover Naoto hire the enigmatic ex-mercenary Alexei to guide them out of the imploding city. But for Danae to reunify, the three new fugitives will have to flee across the otherworldly beauty of the post-apocalyptic Southwest. Meanwhile, Danae's warlord enemy, the Duke, and a strange new foe, the Borrower, already seek them at any price. Evoking the gritty cyberpunk of Mad Max and the fluid idealism of Sense 8, Unity is a spectacular new re-envisioning of humanity. Breakout debut author Ellie Bangs has created an expressive, philosophical science fiction thriller that expands upon consciousness itself. So that's really the best summary I can give you. I think that the blurb wraps it up really well. This book was very cool. I have to check my story graph. I think I gave it 4.5. So I really, really liked it. It wasn't quite a 5-star book for me, but I really liked it and I highly recommend it. I think that it took me quite a bit into the book to feel comfortable and like it was easy to read the writing. I think that it really starts off just kind of dropping you in action, which is great. But I think that you really quickly get introduced to a lot of the characters and the concepts in this book and the jargon and terms of the world. I felt like it was a lot of showing and not telling. I didn't feel like there was a ton of exposition, at least not early on, which I think is great. It was very attention grabbing and it hooked me, but it did, like I said, take me quite a few pages, like maybe 100, maybe like a third of the book to feel like, okay, I've gotten used to this writing style. I've gotten accustomed to the world and I can read comfortably now and really settle into reading and forgetting I'm reading, which is not a problem. But I say that because I think if people pick up this book, I would encourage you to stick with it, even if it's taking you a little while at the start of the book to really get into the world. Gosh, what are the other things I even want to say about this book? I think this book was so cool and I want more people to read it. And I don't want to say too much about the book or give too much away about the book so that people can really read it and have a great time figuring it out and discovering what's going on. I think that the blurb saying how it sort of evokes the gritty cyberpunk of Mad Max was really interesting to me to read because I have only seen the original Mad Max movie. I haven't seen any of the other ones. And I did not like it. In fact, I think I only watched like half of it. I actually don't think I finished Mad Max. I was not a fan, though I am interested in watching Mad Max Fury Road and some of the other ones that I know people really love. And so it was interesting to read the blurb on the back of the book and kind of have Mad Max a little in my mind as I read this book. It definitely does feel like Mad Max in some ways, but to me, it felt like it had so much more plot and world building and explanation of why things are the way they are than Mad Max had from my memory. I felt like Mad Max was kind of just a cool world without too much explanation of why things were the way they were. Whereas this, I felt like was really solid world building. And so it was really fun to read this post-apocalyptic Mad Max feeling story, but enjoy it more. Feel like there was more world building and feel like I cared more about the characters and was more connected with the characters. It is very much, post-apocalyptic Southwest, like it says. It feels like the real world, but in the future, post-apocalypses that I could see happening in the real world. So it is a little bit of a depressing book. Read it carefully when you're in the headspace for that. But I also found it kind of hopeful and beautiful. And I really liked the characters. And I think the book had really cool things to say philosophically, but also just really cool ideas. But yeah, I think that is really my non-spoilery review and recommendation of Unity by Ellie Bangs. I think potential tiny little spoiler that isn't necessarily a plot spoiler, but is kind of a spoiler for some of those cool ideas and discussions that get touched on in the book. And it's maybe about halfway through, so kind of a spoiler. I'll give a spoiler warning. There was one particular part of the book where I just thought, that's so cool. That's such an interesting conversation and such an interesting take on the things that are happening in the book. So just as a little, maybe folks who don't want spoilers have clicked away, but just as a little teaser of things in the book, or to tell those who have read the book, a part of the book that I really enjoyed, I will read a little excerpt. Okay, I found the part of the book that I wanted to share with you all. So, on their post-apocalyptic Mad Max-esque journey across the American Southwest toward their goal, our main characters come across an artist who is making, I forget what the art is called, lightwork art. So they are holograms made up of different sets of shapes and colors, each in a different pattern of liquid motion. And one of our main characters, Danae, stops and talks to the man. And toward the end of their conversation, the man says to Danae, I want you to see something. He went along, tapping each of the holograms to extinguish them until the stall was dark. He took a stack of 5 scuffed panes and set them up in a line, and they sprang to life in sequence, filling the space with a single panoramic mass of blood-red light. From any distance, it was completely amorphous, but every small segment of that drifting red vapor concealed crisp features. Dripping rivulets of yellow fire, humanoid figures in motion. I couldn't tell whether they were dancing or panicking. What almost looked like tiny stairwells of rough-hewn stone. Goodness, Danae sighed in childlike awe. What is this? My great opus, said the sitting man. I have been working on this one for 16 years. This one is not for sale. I cannot finish it. Can never get it right. But what is it? If I lived 1,000 years, I'd still not have enough time to finish it. But what is it? The artist sighed. It's not possible to speak it. To try would only do violence to the entire truth of it. Understand? If I could put it into words, I wouldn't need to put it into light. Light is my only language for it. She broke her gaze with the mass of color. She looked at him, studying his eyes. She leaned over the table to speak giddily into his ear. What if you didn't need a language at all? He squinted. What do you mean? She indicated the glowing morass and said, this all has some meaning for you, something you need to share, right? Words aren't good enough, so you use holographic light art instead. But you can't escape the same fundamental problems. Meaning is always lost on its way between you and your audience. First, it gets corrupted when you try to translate what's inside you into something outside of you, and then it's corrupted again when the viewers try to translate it back into something inside of themselves. I'm saying, what if there were no translation, no medium, no middleman? You could have a thought, a feeling, and you could share it with someone else. No loss or misunderstanding, no noise. The sitting man scratched his chin and stared into space in deep thought. Finally, he opened his mouth and said simply, no. No? What do you mean, no? He looked into his luminous clouds and said, hypothetically, there would be no need for any of this. No need for art of any kind. There would be no art at all. But this is the work of my life, he said solemnly. It is everything I am. For a moment, Danae stood chewing her knuckle in frustrated thought. Then she turned and walked on toward the truck depot, and I looked back to realize that she and Naoto had suddenly reversed roles. He was still back there, staring pensively at the field of holographic light. Finally, he ran to catch up and leaned in to ask her, "Hold on, is that true, Danae?" "Is what true?" she sang, carefree again. He looked over his shoulders and whispered almost too low for me to hear, "Is it true that unified people have no art?" I just thought that part of the book was so cool. And I think that that's very emblematic of the writing in the book and the ideas in the book. So I think if you haven't read the book and you're still here through what I've labeled a potentially spoilery part, and you were interested from that excerpt, I highly recommend the book. So, yeah, I think that is everything that I wanted to share. I just wanted to talk about those two books that I've read recently and kind of share my thoughts on my first Leigh Bardugo book. I will be reading more, and I think that others might land for me better than The Familiar. If you've read The Familiar, I would love to hear what you thought. And if you've read any other Leigh Bardugo, help me know where I need to start in the Grishaverse, because it's kind of unclear to me. And then if you have read Unity, let me know what you thought. And if you haven't and you are interested, I highly recommend it. And I would love to hear what you guys think. But yeah, thanks so much for being here with me. And I will talk to you all later. Bye.